Mr. Cuffs, we're starting review sessions using a packet from Kelly Van Loo of period 1 and 2 in APUSH. So let me show you what that means. Period 1 is de-emphasized by college boards. So if you were studying and you were like working through things, I would spend less time on period 1 and period 9 than the other periods. It's very de-emphasized. It's not going to be much of the test. It's really up to Jamestown. What is Jamestown? It's the first permanent English settlement in the New World, 1607. Period 2, we're also going to do today. Period 2 is colonial America. It's Jamestown to the 7 Years' War, or what they call the French and Indian War in 1754. So it's called the Colonial Era. That is period 2 in history. These periods or units are what they're labeled. So we're using a resource that was made during the COVID year in 2020. And it starts out with all the first stuff. The bold things are really the most important things here in this whole period 1, and there's 2 of them. If I had to boil period 1 down to 2 things that I say are must know, the encomienda system, where they tried to make the American Indians, the natives that were here, they were trying to make the Indians be the laborers for the Spanish settlers. And it's called encomienda. That's a Spanish word. So it's a good way to remember that's a Spanish system of trying to basically enslave American Indians. They were, quote, protected, but it was really just low-key slavery. Okay? There were nothing but epidemics that happened. Disease ravaged the native population. Disease ravaged the native population, and the Spanish forced the natives not only to labor, but to Christianize, intermarry, and dominate with their European cultural norms. And that is the most important thing in this Columbus era. We start this with Columbus. Now, it goes back a little farther than this. It talks about, in the beginning of the notes, the desert culture, forests. It talks about farming in Mexico, even mentions the Aztecs is a formidable power. But honestly, as I look at it, there's only 2 things I feel strongly that you need to know. One is the encomienda system. The second one is the Colombian Exchange. There's a great video when we reviewed for the first quarterly exam. There's a great visual that shows, and I used it. Do you remember on the first quarterly? I used it. It could show up on the AP exam. It showed goods and services, the Colombian Exchange, and it's named after, obviously, Christopher Columbus and his journey. The Colombian Exchange was things that came to Europe from the natives, and then things like disease and horses that went from Europe to North America. And we call this cultural diffusion in global history, but this is really cultural diffusion. So know the things that went. I would take a look at the different crops that went in both directions. Obviously, there's different crops that go, like Europe's bringing olives here, and, they're getting from here things like corn and sweet potatoes, vegetables that are native to this land. Animals are being exchanged. Animals like horses and cows are not native to North America, they're native to Europe, and they're brought here. Obviously, they're going to change the culture of North America and change the native culture. Now, one thing that it doesn't talk about that I would add to this is that name Bartolomé de las Casas. Does anybody remember who he is? Who is Bartolomé de las Casas? Why did I tell you in September he was important? We looked at a primary source document of him. Does anybody remember why? It's a tough one. We're going way back here. He was, I'll give you a hint, he was a Spanish priest. What was different about his writings than every other person's writings in that era? He was what? one? He was a contrarian. He believed that the Europeans were mistreating the American Indians. So the guy's name is De las Casas, Bartolomé de las Casas, and he's a contrarian. That means he went against all of the, I guess using today's words, racist crap that was done. He called them out on it. He called them out on it. So I would add him to that list of what you should know about period 1. And that's it. So the bulk of what we're going to talk about today is going to be period 2, because that's the bulk of the distribution for the test. So let's move to period 2. Bartolomé, it's just long with a B. I wouldn't worry about spelling it. Just write down De las Casas. Okay, period 2. I mentioned it already, but I need somebody in here. I know you guys aren't the loudest bunch. Tell me why Jamestown's important. It was the what? Anybody? First permanent English, good Caitlin, settlement in the New World. So period 2 is 1607, and it starts with Jamestown. Jamestown's in current, what current state is it in? Virginia. It's in the Chesapeake Bay region. I think Madison was just there. So drawing colonial America the best that I can. Jamestown's in this little bay here, the Chesapeake Bay, where Maryland is. And it's not the first settlement of the English. Remember, Roanoke was the first settlement that disappeared. So what we start to see about Jamestown at the beginning of period 2 is a lot of contact between American Indians and different groups. It gets right into the beginning here of the French and what they got from the French. The French settlements are up north, around this region in Canada, in the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, up in the A Bay, all that stuff, the St. Lawrence River. That's a French settlement, okay? The Dutch, we'll talk about a little bit later, just in New York and Pennsylvania. Remember, New York was New Amsterdam. The Spanish are all of this. This is all Spanish. But what we become concerned with the most are the first 13 original English colonies, because that's what will become the country that we are. So it talks a little bit about how they handled the Spanish and the French, and the English and the Dutch, but I want to turn to the second page of this. I want to look at Jamestown a little bit closer here. The group that brought Jamestown here was the Virginia Company. They sent vessels here to build Jamestown. The Powhatan Confederacy wanted an alliance with the Europeans, so they were the union of the American Indians that were here. They liked that we had supplies and tools. The colonists really only survived because of the American Indians, although a lot of them died. A lot of them died. This is the story of Pocahontas, who ends up marrying one of the colonists. What quickly happened here was this cash crop. What is that? Tobacco. Tobacco changes and is why this region sustained despite all of their issues. Tobacco becomes a cash crop, and they learn very quickly that the headright system is not going to be successful, and that by 1619, we see the first of whom brought here against their will. Who gets brought here? This is the beginning of what? Slavery. The first African slaves come in 1619, in large part to work the tobacco plantations, sold by their own people, brought here against their will, and that unfortunateness happens. 3/4 of the English people that migrated to Jamestown, 3/4, that's 75%, were servants, indentured servants. They were here to labor. So I don't want you to think a lot of people came here, even of the English people that came here to get rich. A lot of them were indentured servants. It was a lot of men. Slaves were introduced, but were more expensive at the time than servants, but this is the introduction of them. Now, simultaneously, by 1620, what happens in Massachusetts? In 1620, there's a big rock here. What is that rock called? The Plymouth Rock in 1620. And who comes here then from England? These are coming for different reasons. These are, if you look on your sheet, pilgrims. Those are separatists that believe the English church is corrupt and need to really start a whole independent place. Eventually, Puritans arrive a little bit north. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, they don't have a lot of tolerance for other religions, which is really ironic because the reason they left England was because the Church of England was intolerant, right? So there's an irony there. There's a great irony, or maybe the other word is hypocrisy. Do you understand that? It's ironic or it's hypocritical that the Pilgrims and Puritans had little tolerance for other religions when that's the very reason that they left England. The early Puritan leader, whose name is not on this, but should be, so there's a bolded name missing that you need to know, is a guy named John Winthrop. He's really the first American name you need to know. He is a Puritan leader. If you want to add him to that page, he's the Puritan leader. He leads the Great Migration in the 1630s to Massachusetts Bay. He's the one that wanted the shining city on a hill. This is where Rhode Island and Connecticut are also founded by people that Massachusetts wasn't tolerant of, like Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island. This is where the Salem witch trials took place, which is emphasized here. As we get into period 2, we're going to talk a little bit about slavery in a minute, but let's just talk about the Quakers in Pennsylvania. That is something a little bit different. It gets right into that. So in the late 1600s, the Quakers start coming to Pennsylvania, led by William Penn. It's called Penn's Woods. That's the guy on the Quaker Oats can, William Penn. If you ever eaten Quaker Oats, you've seen his face a bunch of times. He's got like the belt buckle top on his hat. And what is his reason of coming here? Well, his dad was friends with the king, so they didn't like punish these people, but the English government, the English royalty had no use for the Quakers because they were pacifists and refused to fight in all their wars. Remember, they had the Williams War, Anne's War. They didn't want to fight in those wars. They didn't believe in war. They were really like hug, love, cooperation, ahead of their time people. They were peaceful people. So they sent them here and gave them land. That land would be Pennsylvania, and they would set up their holy experiment, as it was called, and it's listed right here at the bottom. They are a haven for pacifism, for religious tolerance. They get different ethnic groups that even come. French Huguenots, okay? Some Dutch, some Swedes, some Germanic people, even some Jews. They become a haven for a little bit different of European people. They have the framework for religious freedom. Penn dealt with the American Indians fairly. He gave them fair money for land. He believed in them as equals. That's new. Pennsylvania became a haven for farmers, modestly priced. So it's a pretty tolerant place. You know, foreshadowing, we're going to get the great Ben Franklin is a Quaker who hails from this area. So they produce him. Turn to the third page. The third page is going to get into, it mentions John Locke. I think it's a little early to mention John Locke, so I'm going to skip that right now, but when I get to period 3, I'll talk more about John Locke. It talks about King Philip's War, a Native American last ditch to, I don't even know if I would worry about that. That's bolded. I'm not sure I'd necessarily worry about it. But what I would circle on this is Bacon's Rebellion. It's really important. It happens 100 years before the American Revolution, 1676 in Virginia. Bacon's Rebellion. What is Bacon's Rebellion? Bacon's Rebellion is a really important rebellion that didn't even work. Why is it so important? Because it showed a couple things. It showed that there was a class difference of the haves and have-nots that is going to be the trend in the South for hundreds of years. So it showed that there were the rich and then everybody else. Everybody else. The haves, the have-nots. The rich and everybody else. The second thing is it showed that there was definitely, I mean, Jamestown got burned to the ground, and that gets mentioned there. But it also showed long-term that there would be colonial resistance to royal authority, because that's like the long-term thing here. So this just gets into the facts about it. It doesn't get into long-term. The last part of the 1700s, this whole Chesapeake region, which is right here, Virginia and Maryland, is going to be all about slaves. Slaves are going to dominate this region from tobacco. They're going to come on the Middle Passage. They are not going to have much sanitation. It is going to be a horrible journey, and a lot of it is what we call triangular trade, which is trade with the Indies, trade with Africa, in some cases trade with Europe. Slaves are the ones that are coming. Obviously they're human beings and they're being like flipped for all different things. Products, rum, tobacco, all sorts of things. So we start to see this whole slave society. The indentured servants and the headright system's unsuccessful. Slaves are now moving even southward. We see new crops like rice and indigo. So we start to see slaves. We're not at cotton yet. That's period 3. That won't be till the cotton gin that becomes a big one, right? In the late 1700s. But in the late 1600s and early 1700s, it's like tobacco production expanding. As tobacco, there could be a graph here. As tobacco expands, the need for slaves expand, right? So if we had a chart here, I feel like I'm doing some math here, right? There's a graph. As tobacco production expands, the need for tobacco expands, we see a need for slaves expanding. And that's an important part of period 2. Now the economic system of period 2 is called mercantilism. We got into this a lot way back in September. Mercantilism is an economic system like capitalism today, where colonies exist to serve a mother country. In this case, the mother country is us, England. We're English. And we, the colonies, exist to serve them. They are enforced through what's called the Navigation Acts. We read through those original documents way back when. The Navigation Acts were all goods that wouldn't spoil had to be shipped through Europe. Total control. All tobacco had to be sold just to Europe. Prices were controlled by, or excuse me, not Europe, England. England. Prices were controlled by England. We couldn't trade with France. We couldn't trade with Spain. It hindered colonial trade. It also didn't allow us to compete with English manufacturing. And you're like, well, what was in it for the colonists? Well, they dominated the tobacco market in England, and they got the protection of the English military, because they were English. So they had the protection of the English military. In this system that limited production had pros and cons. A lot of it wasn't enforced, though. There was a lot of corruption, so a lot of stuff wasn't actually getting shipped through there. What we call this, and if you flip to page 4, we call this salutary neglect. And we get into period 3. Part of the reason the American Revolution happens is at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, salutary neglect ends because England is no longer getting rich off their American colonies. But that's not till period 3. Last page here of period 2 talks about the frontier, property ownership. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I do want to talk a little bit about the Enlightenment, although that's more period 3, and I'm saving that to next week. The only other major 2 things I want to talk about, are you ready? Is to make sure you know Georgia's the last colony and its purpose, that you know that there were 13 colonies, and that you know by the 1700s we're emerging as a society with churches, with lawyers, with banks, with doctors, with commerce. We've got cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, the 4 biggest colonial cities, all are on water. Our big cities grow on water because they have big, great harbors. And then you can trade inland. So 13 colonies with growing cities. Now the last thing, the seeds of the revolution are planted through something that happens in the 1740s called the Great Awakening. It's at the bottom of the 4th page here. The Great Awakening is a religious movement. Jonathan Edwards really believed in his heart that he was saving people from sin. He was a preacher. He wrote something called Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. The bottom of the page. Sinners at the hands of an angry God. God is angry because people are singing. What he preached, and if you flip onto the last page that we're going to cover right before period 3, along with George Whitefield, is that if you want to be saved, you've got to accept Christ as a personal Savior, and you've got to rely on yourself and your faith and learn to have a relationship with God and not listen to the minister on Sundays necessarily. So why is the Great Awakening a step to the American Revolution? This is the final thought for the day. Why? You want to know why? Because the Great Awakening planted the seed of almost like, I don't need to rely on authority. I just need to rely on my own faith. And 20 years later, when authority, being the king figure, was giving us crap, the Great Awakening was in their minds, the rebelliousness of that. The second thing about the Great Awakening, last point, is that the Great Awakening was a religious revival that swept through all the colonies. Edwards was only up in New England, but George Whitefield came through here. George Whitefield came through here, through central New York. Came through all the colonies preaching this message. And what Whitefield does is this is an experience that's collective. This is the first time the Americans from Georgia to New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, North Carolina in between are developing an identity, a colonial identity, and they're having a shared experience of this religion. 1754, the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War breaks out, period 2 ends. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the video.